you're about to hear is audio from the Mentionables 2019 conference held in Waco, Texas. This conference included a panel with the Mentionables, a debate between Mentionable Tyler Vella and atheist Aaron Ra, and several talks from various Mentionable members. Please enjoy this audio and continue listening to the Mentionables.
Awesome. You're live.
Am I live?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Hello, Waco. Glad you could all make it out. All right, so today I'm talking about the problem of many religions. The problem of many religions. Well, first of all, it's the number one objection that the Mentionables get. Now, the Mentionables spend a lot of their time addressing questions that come from atheists, usually ones we hunt out, lists of questions or videos and so forth that we then respond to. And we also respond to questions that are submitted to us, usually by Christians. So answering questions is the majority of what the Mentionables do, and a surprising number of those questions involve the problem of other religions. So what's the problem? Well, one of them is this, and if you traffic in the world of apologetics or online atheism or so forth, you're familiar with this objection. It essentially says that you're only a Christian because you were born in a Christian context. Possibly you were raised in a Christian family or in a church, or you're born in America where Christianity is the number one religion and so forth. If you had been born in India, you'd be a Hindu. If you'd been born in Afghanistan, you'd be a Muslim. And if you'd been born in Utah, you'd be a Mormon. So you're only what you are because of where you were born, which isn't a great reason to be that. Another one would be, it's not working for me, so I'll just work from here. Another one would be this idea that you have firm reasons why you remain a Christian, and you've got whatever evidence you operate off of, you've got your own holy book, you've got a lot of things that convince you that you're right. But the Muslim down the street has a lot of things that convinces them that they're right. So how can you sit there and say that your reasons are superior to their reasons? What makes their conviction not as good as your conviction? So, try and click this some more. There we go. Yeah, and then again, the other thing is, so the Mormons will say if you read the Book of Mormon, you feel a burning in your bosom, which is this evidence that it is correct. Or, Christians will say, William Lane Craig says that the very bottom of the level, the thing that shows the truth of Christianity is the compulsion of the Holy Spirit. So you feel this deep connection to the Holy Spirit or to your God, and that's one of the things that convinces you. But then, of course, the Muslim praying 5 times a day to Allah, or the Jew who's reading the Torah and believes that he has a connection to God, and so forth, all of them feel this deep conviction. So what explains everyone's conviction and makes one of them right and the rest of them wrong? And so let's say that you present a very compelling case for the existence of God, say from the ontological argument or the moral argument or the cosmic argument or so forth. Then what makes it your God? Why isn't it Zeus or Amun-Ra or any of these other gods that are out there? Why yours? So then we have the outsider test. The outsider test was popularized by John Loftus, who was himself an apologist for a while, and he was a preacher, and he actually studied under William Lane Craig. And so then he came to reject Christianity. Why? Well, his reason was this. You look at, say, the Muslim claim that Allah split the moon. And, of course, you view that with incredulity. Not only is it counterindicated by the evidence, but it also seems really far-fetched. But then you read the Bible and it says that Moses parted the Red Sea, and you're okay with that. No problem with that, but the moon thing? No, you can't have that. Or let's say you're watching the History Channel and there's something about the paranormal on, because that's what plays on the History Channel anymore. And on the paranormal event, It'll talk about, say, a couple of guys that walked past a graveyard and then they saw some guy stumble out of his coffin and get up and, ooh. Now you hear that and you're going to think, well, there are cases where they thought the guy was dead and he wasn't, he got up, so that happens. Or, people make up stories. So you're not going to immediately jump to the supernatural explanation. But then you hear the argument that Jesus rose from the dead, and you're okay with the supernatural explanation, and that's just your preconceptions that are coming forth. So if you look at it if you look at Christianity with the same skepticism that you look at any other far-fetched supernatural claim, then it'll dissolve the same way that these other accounts do. So the outsider test, you step outside of your preconceptions, you look back in on them, and bam, there goes Christianity. And that's honestly his primary argument. He calls it the outsider test. So you've got that. So you get the idea. Any argument against Christianity that involves invoking these other religions as evidence that Christianity can't be true is the problem of other religions. And another objection would be, you've got God. The real true God who wants everyone to believe in him and so forth, and yet he lets all these other religions happen that are out there. Now, why would God do that if he wanted people to believe in him? So that's another objection that you'll get to. So the first thing I want to address is this. I think I can argue convincingly that the fact that there are so many religions out there all over the world can actually be evidence for God. Now, how do I do this? The first one I'm going to talk about is sensus divinitatis. Now, this is a fancy Latin word which means the sense of the divine. This idea that everyone sort of, you've heard it said that everybody has a God-shaped hole in their heart. This idea that we, in somewhere inside ourselves, we have this sort of knowledge of God, which you get in the Bible, right? In Romans it says that knowing that he is, they suppress the truth in unrighteousness. So this idea that's fundamental to, say, presuppositionalism, that they really do in some way know that God exists. So this sensus divinitatis, we have a sense of God. Now, how do I tie that back in? Well, a number of years ago, I wrote an article on apologetics, and it began like this. I said that you have this atheist that'll come along and they'll debate with a Christian and say, hey, if God is real, then why are we having this debate? The idea being that, if there is this all-powerful creator of the universe who wants everyone to have a connection with him, why is that in question at all? Why don't we already know about that so firmly that we have any room to doubt? So why have an argument if he's real? And I said that, the apologist could turn around and say, if God doesn't exist, then why are we having this argument? The idea being, we meet on a stage and you say that God definitely doesn't exist and I say that he does. We're both referring to something that either does or doesn't exist. We both have this idea in our head that this thing called God doesn't or does exist. Where did that concept come from, and why can we agree on it enough to argue about its existence? Where did it come from? Well, I actually got some atheists respond to the article, and they were like, oh, well, where does the idea of fairies come from? We can argue about the existence of fairies. We both have an idea of fairies. Where does that idea come from? You can come up with any number of non-existent things that you both have an idea about and can argue. Well, my response to that was this. I said that, okay, I will go out into the world or find somewhere in history or geography some individual, lucid individual, who doesn't have any concept of what a fairy is. Now you go out in somewhere in history or geography and find me one lucid individual who doesn't know what you're talking about when you talk about God. Then let's meet back and compare notes. This idea that everybody, everywhere, has some kind of conscious perception of the idea of an all-powerful, unseen agency, what we call God. And I can back this using science. So, in the study cited up on the screen are Children Intuitive Theists, a 2004 study by Deborah Kellerman. And this was an actual legitimate, published, peer-reviewed study. And basically what they did is that they took children as young as they could get them that they'd be able to test, and they tested them for certain kinds of ideas. And they were able to find proof that these children already had this concept, this intuitive concept of unseen agency, meaning that things that happen in the world are somehow directed consciously by something. And, we all have that. We bust a tire on the way down the highway. We have to pull off to the side and we're late for something. Why did this happen to me? Well, the only way that question makes sense is if there is some kind of guidance behind that event, some kind of agency that makes that happen. And you get kids that are in a room alone and they're talking to someone. Who are they talking to? They're talking to this sort of perception they have of an unseen agency. Agency means something that's capable of consciously acting within the world. And they were able to run tests, and children actually have that sense. Well, in addition to having the sense of unseen agency, they found that children have a sense. That's not the study up there. I'll get to that study. This is the same one, the Children Intuitive Theists. And they found in that study that not only do the children start with this concept of unseen agency, they also start with this concept of purpose behind things that happen and behind things that exist. So in the study, for instance, they showed the children these pointed rocks that are out in the wilderness that erosion had caused to erode into points. And they asked the kids, well, what are those for? And the kids, well, those are for animals to scratch their back. So, these children assumed that the rocks had been put there for some kind of purpose. And so in their mind, they made up the purpose. And you get kids to do this a lot. You can take a kid out, point at any given thing that is out there and ask the kid, what's that for? The kid will make up a reason because in their mind, they believe that things exist for a purpose. And so do you. This is let's see if I can get that. Yeah. Take a look at that critter up there. There's like 3 of you. What's the first question that comes to mind when you see that? Exactly. That's the first question that comes to my mind. What's that for? What does that do? Well, that question alone, which is the intuitive question, a scientist see that picture, they're going to ask the same question. What's that thing for? The idea being that you intuitively jump to the notion that that exists for a purpose. It does something. Now then you're going to get into the quibble with the scientist about, well, how did it get there? The scientist will say, well, it was useful when it first developed, so it continued to develop over time because it had a use as opposed to a purpose. But nevertheless, the first thing that jumps into your mind is not that just happens to be there, but that exists for some reason. And they do this with scientists that are atheists. They'll show them quick things and they'll ask them to jump to questions and they'll force them to be intuitive instead of analytical about the thing. And when they're intuitive about it, the immediate assumption that jumps to mind is, well, it exists for some purpose. It's there. And of course, the children start with that notion. But moving on to the study cited behind me there, that study is something that was done in 2011. And it was a survey that they did of as many cultures as they could possibly survey across the globe using surveys and statistics and so forth. And what they found was that everywhere, in every culture, across the geography, no matter how connected or unconnected they were to the modern world, they had a predominant belief in some kind of God concept and some concept of an afterlife, some kind of life that came after death. And so you can find this universally across all cultures. Just look. Everybody's got an idea of an afterlife. It's in all mythology, it's in all writing and everything. That just is the case, and every culture has an idea of God. So, what have we got? We've got that people are practically born with a notion of something that looks a lot like God, unseen agency, and the idea that things exist for some purpose, that they were purposeful.
And of course, every culture has some kind of concept of God. Now, where did that come from? I would argue that that is evidence that there is some kind of God. But if there is some kind of God, why not Thor or Cthulhu or Gaia? Why does it have to be your God? All right, we've gotten to the point where I've presented a reason, a reasonable explanation for why there are so many God concepts across the world. Maybe it's because Scripture is correct and everybody has this intuitive belief in God. But why our God? Why not some other God out there? Well, in order to address that, I'm going to look at a couple of things that we can see across time and history. One is religious drift. What do I mean by religious drift? Well, let me go into it. There's this guy named Zoroaster. He was around the 1500s BC. And Zoroaster lived in Iran at the time when it was a very polytheistic society. So, everybody had dozens of gods and temples full of statues that they worshipped and so forth. And what did Zoroaster do? Well, he came to a fundamental problem with this concept of multiple gods, because over here you've got the god of pestilence, and this god is always sending locusts and diseases and everything. And over here you've got the god of harvest, and this god is sending good harvest, if you please him enough. And of course you want the good harvest, you don't want the pestilence over there, but what makes this one right and that one wrong? Why does it make one god a good guy and one god a bad guy? And then you throw all the other gods in there. So here you have the goddess of wisdom. Well, does that mean the other gods can't have wisdom? Is wisdom exclusive to this god? Is she, above all the other gods, dispensing wisdom to them so they're able to, and you get this conflict that continually occurs based on the domain of each god, and how does one determine the morality or the standard against which each god is judged? They're underneath some kind of standard. So Zoroaster's solution to this was to get rid of all the gods and just keep two. You had the god of order, you had the god of chaos. So you have this god of wisdom and order and enlightenment over here. You've got this god of chaos and disaster and all of that stuff over here. And he said that they're locked into an eternal conflict with one another. And that was his best way of explaining, breaking down what is an overly complicated system into a very simple system. And if you follow this God, you're bringing about more order to the world. If you follow this God, you're bringing about more chaos to the world. And you're aiding each God in their mission to make the world either entirely ordered or entirely chaos. So, religious drift refers to this idea of an evolution of the religious idea. But there's more. I'm going to talk about the Greek philosophers. Sorry, got ahead of myself. Greek philosophy, Hellenistic philosophy, really got kicked off by Socrates. And Socrates, we only know about him. He never wrote anything. We know about him through Plato. Among the things that Socrates did was to reject the pantheon. So he went straight from all these gods to none of these gods, or at least not multiple gods. And then Plato, influenced by his teacher, started to develop upon this concept. And Plato said, well, how do we explain all of these abstractions when all we're looking at is reality? How do things like pure good or reason or justice or these things exist? How do they manifest? What are they attached to? Are they real, or are they just illusions that we have? And so Plato came down to this idea that there must be this abstract thing called the good. He titled it The Good. And this is the source of all of these abstracts that we have. So, whereas Zoroaster had essentially the good and the bad, Plato, he narrowed it just down to the good. Now, how does that explain bad? Well, he would say that bad is more or less the absence of good, in the same way that dark is the absence of light. So it's the privation of good. You remove good from a situation. So you could say things like murder is bad because life is good. Theft is bad because ownership is good. adultery is bad because marriage is good. Essentially, the bad is defined by the good. Can't have one without the other. And so that's religious drift. He's bringing the religion around from this sort of polytheistic, system where it's very arbitrary as to what God you worship and what they do and how powerful they are and so forth. And he's bringing it down to a narrower concept that is much more explanatory if we're going to appeal to theism. And then you have Aristotle. Aristotle came up with this idea of the prime mover. What's that? Well, Aristotle observed that, there are all these things happening in the world, but if you follow them back, it's a chain of events that led up to those things. So the world was dominated by this process of change. Things were constantly in flux and motion and change, but each motion, each change was dependent upon the change before it. And so he said you could either reverse that eternally or there had to be some kind of source. But let's say that you set up a bunch of dominoes. You lean down, push them over, and all this chain of events occurs. That could be similar to what Aristotle's talking about, but here's the problem. When you push it, you've changed. You yourself have had to change, have had to create motion in order to start it off, and so you become part of the chain of events. What he wanted was an unmoved mover, something that was not changed as it changed other things. And so he came up with a concept, not so much of a push God, but a pull God, a God that was just a force that actualized things into existence and therefore remained unchanged. So his illustration was like if you put a bowl of milk out, the milk will compel the cat to come to it without itself being changed. And that was his best way of envisioning. So you've got Plato that comes up with the good, the standard that everything can be derived from. And you've got Aristotle that comes up with the unmoved mover, this force that enacts upon things. So what am I talking about? You go from a polytheistic society with so many gods, and over time, as they become more developed and sophisticated in their thought, it starts to look a lot more like the Christian concept of God over time. And then tribal religions. Tribal religions, I bring them up because if you go to any particular tribal religion, they'll have gods, sure, they'll have spirits, they'll have all of these concepts, but they always have this one overarching God, this God above gods, if you will. And, this intuitive concept of a ruler God, some chief among them that everything proceeds from. And so the other gods become just very powerful beings that embody some sort of aspect of nature, but there's always a governor above them. And so again, this is this intuition, this drift towards a concept that looks a lot more like monotheism and the Christian God. All right. Now I'd like to talk about the coping benefits of religion. So this is part of a study I did a little bit back in which I looked into, I had looked at this concept, this sort of argument that for some reason the poorer and more poor off a country is, the more religious that country is. So I wanted to look at that claim, and it turns out that's very true. The wealthier a nation is, the less religious it is. So if you look at the wealthiest nations right now, the amount of religion in those nations is fairly low. But if you get into poorer and poorer countries, the poorer a country is, the more religious it is. Well, why is this? There's a couple of explanations, but what it boils down to is that religion has some very strong coping effects to it. So there's a social aspect. You all sort of cohere and you go into, say, worship events and so forth together, and you create this kind of network of individuals that are bound together by common morality, common goals, common shared values. So that's helpful. But, when they look at the life satisfaction and other things in these poor countries that are highly religious, and then compare them with the average life satisfaction of people in a wealthier country that is very poorly religious, the irreligious person in America is actually less satisfied than the highly religious person in, say, a sub-Saharan African tribe. So despite that one has it physically poorer off, the one that has it well better off in the wealthier country is less satisfied. Well, that would seem to be an argument against religion if you think about it, because and atheists do make this argument. They make the argument that religion is invented as a crutch, as a coping mechanism, as something that helps out when you're down. But as you move away, as you need that crutch less, then you need religion less. Well, that's what it is, but in the study that I did, I then came across this one. Religion and Well-Being was a study that I looked at the end of my series. And Religion and Well-Being was a great study because it didn't just, measure the satisfaction of religion as a concept. It actually looked at particular religions, and it started to look at demographics within that religions and beliefs reflected by that religion. And what it found was that monotheism tends to have better coping mechanisms, has a more beneficial system, has higher benefits, let's say, than a polytheistic or even a pantheistic system. Why that? Well, pantheism doesn't focus on community, it focuses on individual, whereas monotheism really focuses on community. Polytheism tends to cause cells to break off, as people choose the God they want to worship, but under monotheism, we're united under a single God. Well, that doesn't prove God in any sense, but then there are other things. So they looked at, say, Catholicism, and there was less life satisfaction in Catholicism as there were in other Christian denominations, and they related that to sort of this, this sense of guilt that Catholicism sort of fosters. You've heard of Catholic guilt. Well, apparently it's a real thing, because in this study, there's a lot of virtues to Catholicism, but it's not the most satisfying religion, and they linked it to the sense of guilt that they had. And then you would look at, say, Judaism, and Judaism has definitely some coping benefits, but the people in Jews have less life satisfaction than, say, Christians, and they linked it to the sort of idea of this loss that they had over this promise or this land that they're looking forward to that has not yet been accomplished. So Judaism is always looking forward to this future hope that has not yet been accomplished. The religion that they found had the best coping, the highest life satisfaction, was Protestant Christianity. What beliefs did they link this to? They linked it to this sort of concept of a loving God, a personal loving God, to this idea that ultimate justice will come so that we can look forward to justice being served in the world, and that there is forgiveness and mercy so that we have the benefit of that. It had a very positive idea of an afterlife. In other words, all of the best concepts in religion sort of come together and manifest in Protestant Christianity. So that's good. That is not a sufficient argument for the truth of Christianity, but it doesn't hurt. And it also shows that the closer religions come in the spectrum towards Christianity, the better life satisfaction you have as well. So philosophically, Christianity is the most robust of the religions, and in terms of life satisfaction benefits, it's the most robust in the system. So this is, again, religious drift. They drift toward this central system, which is essentially what's represented in Protestant Christianity. All right, we just had a big old debate about science and religion, so little needs to be said about this, but I will say this much. In a lot of these polytheistic systems, you can see that a lot of the polytheism just existed to sort of address the phenomenology of the world around us. So you look into the mythology and you have these dying and rising god epics that explain the seasons. So, Odin goes to sleep in the winter and it gets cold. And then Odin raises up in the summer or spring, and then we start to address toward summer and so forth. And lightning comes from Thor's hammer, and volcanoes are from Vulcan's forge and so forth. So they're not really explaining the sort of metaphysics as so much as they're explaining physics. Those gods are existing as explanations for nature around us. So you often see this claim that's touted by Neil deGrasse Tyson and so forth, that as science advances, religion shrinks because we have less and less need of God. But of course, this is addressing an idea, a religious system which is using God as a substitute for physical phenomena. Now, that would definitely be true of polytheism, because once we find out what makes lightning, we don't need Thor anymore. Once we find out what makes winter come, we don't need Odin anymore. All of these things are now explained through science. But that doesn't explain away the Christian God, because the Christian God transcends all of that. It is possible for there to be a transcendent God and to be a physical system which has the mechanics to run without that God in a hamster wheel in the center running the whole thing. But it goes better than that, because if you look in the Bible, you notice a tremendous lack of these mythological elements where God is being invoked to explain physical phenomena. At no point in the Bible do you say that the wind is God's breath, or the sun is his eye, or that he's grabbing the world and shaking it to cause earthquakes. Throughout the Bible, God is very transcendent or removed from the creation. That's not to say that he's not linked to the structure of the creation, but he's not inside of it, manipulating it with his hands or so forth. He is the cause, but not He is the causal agent that begins the creation, but he's not inside of creation, operating as an agent of creation. So Christianity has a benefit in that it doesn't prevent science in terms of the way that it's structured. And even in the Bible, it looks a lot different from all the other religious systems that were contemporary, because it's not using God as an explanation for the mechanics of the universe. So then you see that this allows this concept of a God that is immanent but transcendent, and the creator but not the mechanism of creation, allowed science to blossom and bloom in the Christian world. So every field of science that you have got kicked off by a Christian, I think you'll find. I'd be hard-pressed to find a field of science that didn't have a Christian involved in the creation of it. So, and that's because the religious system of Christianity allowed, philosophically, for us to develop this concept of science and scientific method and the exploration of the universe. Now, unlike a sort of naturalistic system where they're just kind of looking at things and trying to figure out that thing, the Christian concept of science would be more like a reverse engineering. You assume that there is some kind of design or purpose behind it, and you're just trying to figure out what that is. And so we get back to the dinosaur I just showed you. What's that thing for? You assume it has some purpose. You assume it got there through some process and serves some reason, and all you're doing is reverse engineering it to try to find out why. It results in the exact same kind of science that we see in natural, in sort of this materialist sense. It's just the philosophy behind it is a little bit different. So again, Christianity, unlike a lot of religions, allows for science. All right, so we just said that monotheism is the best religious system philosophically and metaphysically and so forth, but why the Christian God? Why not this sort of Judaistic God that doesn't include Jesus and the Trinity? Or why not, Islam, which has a monotheistic God, but again, no Trinity? See if we can figure it out. All right, so the answer to this would be the person of Jesus. We ultimately have to look to Jesus to see which of the three major monotheistic religions could possibly be the correct one. Now, if Jesus existed, that doesn't negate any of those. In fact, the existence of Jesus is very important to Islam. So, but if Jesus died, then Islam is no longer a live option because Islam stresses that Jesus did not in fact die, that he just went from being on earth to ascending to heaven. So if historically we can show that Jesus died, Islam's no longer a live option. If Jesus rose, Judaism is no longer an option, because in Judaism you don't have individuals rising from the dead, and you certainly don't have individuals saying that they were God and then rising from the dead. If he was Messiah under the zeitgeist of your typical Judaism, then he should have ridden in triumphantly and done something and caused the liberation of Israel and the domination of the Messiah thereafter. So really, the death and resurrection of Jesus is the clincher that puts Christianity down. And when I say that, it means it makes it the most probable of the religions. Yeah. So. All right. Now, I was kind of, unfortunately, one of the mentionables who was supposed to come this week couldn't make it. And Nick Peters is our resident expert on the argument for the resurrection. And I was hoping he would be here to help me with this, but he's not, so I'm going to make a brief argument for the resurrection of Jesus. The first is that the best evidence we have for Jesus is the Gospels. And in order to make the Gospels good evidence, we have to show that they are in some way eyewitness accounts. So, in order to do that, we would need to show that they were first, that these accounts themselves must have come fairly early on. They can't be late accounts, or it's not as helpful if they're late accounts because they could then be somewhat mythological. They could be changed over time. The earlier we can show that they are, the more likely they are to be accurate to the events that they're describing. So, one of the things that's helpful in that early dating is the verse in 1 Corinthians 15 that talks about where Paul sits down and tells his readers that I delivered to you that which I first received, that Christ died according to the Scriptures and was buried in 3 days according to the Scriptures and rose again. And then thereafter he appeared to Peter and the disciples and even 500 people at one time. So he gives this whole spiel, and this is more or less universally agreed upon to be a very early account, because the way in which Paul phrases it when he gives it is exactly the way that you would have an oral tradition passed on in a Judaistic system. You know, I delivered that which I first received is a typical rabbinic start to talking about a tradition that's been passed along rabbinically. So Paul is falling back on his training as a Pharisee in order to convey this early tradition. So that's an indication that at least very early tradition, which scholars rate within a few years of Jesus' death, has to say that he existed, he died, he rose again, and then there are eyewitnesses. So that's helpful in determining the early concept of this idea that Jesus died and then rose. Now, we have to talk about Mark. Mark is the shortest of the Gospels and is the Gospel most closely linked to... I'm going to have to cut down time, right, Mark? Well, I don't want to cut into your time too much. I'll try to speed this up a little bit. Mark is the earliest of the Gospels, and it is the one that scholars find most likely to be the reliable Gospel because it took place closer to the events. Mark is said by scholars to, early testimony. If we look at the early church writings, it says that Mark got his writings from Peter. So Peter was preaching in Rome. Mark wrote down what Peter was saying. And there's some evidence for that because if you look at Mark, if you look at it closely, and I'm going off the writings of Jim Warder Wallace here, that it has all the hallmarks of an eyewitness testimony linked to Peter. So Peter is the main character. He's the one that's always kind of at the forefront in Mark. So it'll say that things like Peter and the disciples went out, etc. So he's the main character in that. There's more, but I'll skip ahead. Then we have the other Gospels, which kind of quote Mark a lot. So if they're working off an early testimony that comes from Peter, and there's evidence for that, and the other Gospels are kind of quoting this, then they're also pulling from eyewitness testimony. One of these is Luke, who says that, explicitly at the beginning of his Gospel, that he is trying to organize all of the eyewitness testimony that he has access to. And if he's quoting Mark, then that's helpful because we have evidence to believe that Mark is eyewitness testimony. Then we have Paul, who goes along and quotes Luke. Paul quotes Luke. See, I'm ahead of myself there. Paul quotes Luke twice in 1 Corinthians. One point in 1 Corinthians, he quotes a statement from Jesus where he's talking about the workers, the laborers worthy of their wages. And this is a quote pulled directly from Luke and nowhere else in the Scripture, but Paul says, the Scripture says when he says this. And then he also gives his testimony of, I received, and he talks about the Eucharist, about the Last Supper and how Christ broke bread and so forth. But the way he phrases that is the exact phrasing that comes from Luke. So you have Paul, with whose writings were fairly early, quoting from Luke, who was quoting from Mark. So we're seeing a progression of eyewitness testimony here. I'm going to skip the undesigned coincidence. We'll leave that, the rest of that, for my evidence that we have eyewitnesses in there. And then I'm going to talk about a little bit what happened to the eyewitnesses. So we have early sources, both from the early Christians writing and from external sources like Josephus that talk about, specifically we have Peter and James and Paul. It talks about their martyrdom and torture and so forth. And there are other saints that are mentioned specifically in the writings of the church fathers that were tortured and killed. Now, if somebody dragged me out in the street and asked me to renounce Christ and put a gun to my head and I said no, and they shot me, how would that prove that Christ is real? I mean, I believe it, but I don't have access to enough evidence to prove it to that I have reason. But if these people are saying they're eyewitnesses of Jesus, then they know whether or not they're making up a lie. And if they are lying that they're eyewitnesses of Jesus, then they're dying for a lie. They're getting tortured and killed for some kind of lie that they're really committed to. Well, people don't do that for a lie. They would do it for the truth. So these people really, really, really believe that they were eyewitnesses of Jesus. So that's my brief defense of the resurrection. There's a great deal more that could be said on that point. I'm going to talk about the success of Christianity very briefly. You're talking about how all religions are the same. Well, Christianity is not. And I want to talk about Jesus' incarnation. So I've seen this meme float around where it says that, Jesus came at a really terrible time in history. He came to a very low populated area, and, he could have come to a higher populated area like China or India where there are a lot of people who could be exposed to his message. He was born in an age when there was not mass communication. If he'd been born today, he could have made his own YouTube channel, gotten 1 million subscribers, and had people all around the world know about him in a couple of days. Why would God, if God really became incarnate and wanted people to know about it, why would he just appear in a backwater area of the central, Middle East, and at a time when there is no mass communication? Well, it's interesting because there is a lot of good history going on at the time that Jesus is incarnated. So, first of all, Jesus was born in a post-Hellenistic society, meaning that prior to the Romans, the Greeks were the conquering area in the world. And what did the Greeks do? Well, Alexander the Great had this tactic of enlisting a bunch of people from a place that he'd just conquered into his army, so he had an ever-growing army as he rolled across the world. But he had a problem. Every time he enlisted people from a new area, and then he gave the order to charge. That order had to be retranslated in different languages all down the line. So what the Greeks started to do was to create a pidgin form of the Greek language, which could then become sort of a second language that everybody knew. And so the world became successfully Hellenized because everybody kind of knew a little Greek, so that everybody had a common language. And that was a really good thing. It allowed for trade, it allowed for communication, and at some point before Jesus came along, they had the scriptures translated into this Greek language in this process that I won't go into, but yeah, there was a Greek version of the Bible by the time Jesus was born. So Jesus happened to be born into a society when there was a common language throughout the known world that everybody had access to. Now, after Alexander the Great the Romans came. And what did the Romans do? They built roads. They built really, really, really good roads. And this allowed for great travel all over the Roman Empire. So now we have a common language that everybody has access to. You have a fantastic road system that makes trade and travel extremely easy in a world where it wasn't before the Romans came along. So whereas it would have been taken a very long time for them to spread a message or any kind of thing before the Romans came, it was now very quick to spread. Anybody ever play the game of Risk? No Risk players in here? All right, if you've ever played Risk, you'll be aware that the property that changes hands the most often is the most hotly contested is the Middle East. Why is that? Well, it just happens that the Middle East is the throughway for 3 continents. You got Europe, Asia, Africa, they all connect through the Middle East right there. And so it's hotly contested because it's strategically a very good position. You can block travel from one continent to the other, or you can not get through there if you don't control it. So this is real to history. You ever notice that in the scripture, and if you study history in general, you see that the Middle East is constantly changing hands, especially Judea. Throughout the Bible, it's constantly getting conquered by somebody new. Why is that? It just happens to be a very good strategic location. It's located right on the Mediterranean, which gives it access to the best trade ports all over. So whereas all roads lead to Rome, all roads happen to lead through Israel. So now we have Jesus born in a time when there is a common language everyone has access to, travel is extremely easy, and it just so happens that all trade and travel for the world is going to pass through the center of the area in which Jesus was born. That's a lot of coincidences that make for a very successful spread of what was otherwise a very small cultic religion that started with 12 people. And we see this historically. Christianity spread like wildfire and was very successful, which is sort of a unique thing that Christianity has that no other religion could say, especially since it was started with one guy and a bunch of fishermen. All right, so let's look at these specific objections. If you're born somewhere else, you'd be some other religion, right? So, first of all, that's the genetic fallacy right there. Genetic fallacy refers to this idea that the truth or falsity of something is reliant on where that piece of information came from. So, if, Hitler had stood there and said that butterflies help to pollinate plants, I couldn't believe that because Hitler was evil. No information that came from his mouth could possibly be true. Whereas if Mother Teresa told me that snow came from the moon, she was really good. So that's a good piece of information right there. And I've heard it said by certain members of the Mentionables that, if you learn that the Earth orbits the sun from a comic book, it's just as accurate as if you learn it from a physics book. So this idea that, being born in a location kind of negates the religion you learned there. No. All right, and then the other idea is, you will be grown up, you will mature and become the religion that you were taught as a child. Now, that's not true. They've actually done tests where, your religiosity as a child has no correlation of your religiosity as an adult. I mean, we just had two people on stage that had a debate. One used to be a Christian and became an atheist. One used to be an atheist and became a Christian. And that's symptomatic of what you see when children become adults. They tend to remove themselves from the context of a child under authority in a family, and they start to mature into an adult themselves, who then tries to test all the boundaries and all the things that they've been taught as a child, and they tend to become their own person with their own beliefs that are not necessarily the same as the family. They may be informed by the family, but they're not always the same. So the indoctrination theory kind of falls off. Next, let's look at statistics. 30% of the world are Christians. That is huge. Islam's trying to creep up there, but it's still got a ways to go before it matches Christianity. That means that if you were to pull 3 people from anywhere in the world, likely one of those people is going to be a Christian, just statistically speaking. In addition to that, Christianity is the only religion that has some presence in every country, everywhere. So, even though, say, Saudi Arabia is going to be a majority Muslim, there are going to be isolated pockets of Christians somewhere in that country. And that really can't be said of any other, even Islam hasn't gotten there yet. So it's not as if there's some person in the world now that doesn't know anything about Christianity and has no access to it. There's going to be a church somewhere, even if it's very underground. So Christianity has been more successful and has more presence than any other religion out there. All right, I'm not going to get into the outsider test. I think most of what the information that I've given now is sufficient to address that, and I'm creeping well into the time of the next presenter. Mark? No, Mark? Would you be okay with me taking a couple of questions, or are we...
Whatever. If anybody's got one, go for it.
Okay. There may be no questions. Any questions? Nope. All right. Well, thank you. Yes, sir.
When I play Risk, I usually just wait around until everybody else takes everyone out. How does that fit into your analogy?
Well, that sort of kills it. Thanks. Thanks a lot. All right. Well, you've all been great, and of course I'll be here for the question and answer after the conference, so if you think anything between now and then, let me go.